There's a sound the North Gate makes at 5:47 in the morning. It's not a creak. Not exactly. It's more like the gate is clearing its throat, a low, iron-deep groan that starts somewhere in the hinges and travels outward until it dissolves into the cold London air. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then silence, the kind that feels heavier than before the sound existed. Tarek knew that sound the way most people know their own heartbeat, without thinking, without choosing to. He was 11 the first time he heard it. His mother had dragged him to London for what she called a proper education in the world outside our four walls, which in practice meant standing in the wet, gray cold outside Buckingham Palace at hours that no 11-year-old should be legally awake. She was a schoolteacher back in Karachi. She believed in primary sources. She believed that seeing a thing with your own eyes placed it permanently inside you in a way no textbook photograph ever could. She was right, but she couldn't have known what she was placing inside her son. They had arrived on a Tuesday, November. The kind of November that London specializes in. Not dramatically cold, not dramatically rainy, just permanently, personally damp, as if the city itself were slightly offended by your presence and expressing it through weather. Their hotel was a 12-minute walk from the palace. Tarek knew this because he counted steps. He had always counted steps. His mother called it a quirk. His schoolmates called it weird. Tarek called it the only way to make sense of a world that moved faster than he did. 741 steps from the hotel door to the gate. He counted them that first morning. Then he counted them again the next morning. Then the one after that. The number never changed. That steadied something in him he hadn't known needed steadying. But it was the sound that changed everything. They had arrived early, his mother's doing, always his mother's doing, before the tourist crowds, before the souvenir carts set up their postcards and their novelty guardsman hats, before London properly woke up and decided to perform itself for visitors. The plaza was almost empty. Just a few pigeons conducting their morning business along the gravel, and a pair of German tourists in matching green rain jackets consulting a paper map with the grave intensity of people defusing something. And then the gate opened. Not the main gate. The North Gate. A side entrance, utilitarian, less photographed. A palace staff member was entering. Some administrator, Tarek assumed, some person whose job involved the palace's interior logistics. The gate swung open on its hinges and produced that sound. That throat-clearing groan. Low and metallic and oddly dignified, like something old that had decided long ago it would not apologize for its age. Tarek stopped walking. His mother kept going 3 steps before she noticed and turned. "Tarek, did you hear that?" She looked at him. Then, at the gate, which had already closed. The gate. The way it opened. She blinked at him with the patient confusion she reserved for conversations she didn't know how to enter. Then, she took his hand and steered him gently toward the main viewing area, and the moment passed, and they watched the changing of the guard with the rest of the tourists, and his mother took 17 photographs, and Tarek stood very still and thought about the sound. That night in the hotel room, while his mother slept, he wrote it down in the small green notebook he carried everywhere. North Gate. 5:47 a.m. Like a man clearing his throat before saying something important. 2 seconds. Iron. Deeper than the East Gate will probably be. He had not yet heard the East Gate. He had written will probably be because he had already decided he was going to hear it. He was 26 when this story really begins. 15 years of returning. Not every year. Money didn't always allow it. And then university, and then the job at the logistics firm in Karachi that paid well enough but asked for all of his time. But he came when he could. 7 trips total. And on each trip, the notebook came with him. The original green one was long destroyed, waterlogged in a monsoon sometime during his university years. But he had transferred everything to a new one. Then another. He was on his 4th notebook now. Brown leather, slightly too small for his handwriting, purchased from a stall near Sadar that the owner's son now ran. Each notebook contained the same kind of entries. Galatasolans, times, weather conditions, because he had learned that weather changed the acoustics. The temperature of the air, whether there was wind and from which direction, whether it had rained recently, because wet iron sang differently than dry iron, a half-pitch lower, he thought, richer, like a voice with something caught in it. The East Gate, as he had predicted in that first notebook, was different from the North. The East Gate was sharper. A two-part sound, a click first, precise, and military, the latch releasing, and then the swing itself, which was quieter than you'd expect, almost secretive, as if the gate were trying not to make a scene. He had first heard it on his third visit, at 19, standing in the early morning where the tourist crowds hadn't yet assembled. He'd written, East Gate. Click then, quiet, like someone making a decision they've already made before. The West Gate he heard only once. It was being repaired on most visits, scaffolding, maintenance work, or simply closed for reasons the palace didn't advertise. He caught on his fifth trip, at 22, in the early evening when the light was going orange over the Victoria Memorial and the tourists were doing the golden hour photograph thing in clusters. A supply vehicle was exiting. The gate swung wide and produced a sound unlike the others, a sustained metallic note, almost a moan, with a vibration at the end that he felt in his sternum before he heard it with his ears. He stood absolutely still. The tourists photographed the memorial. He stood still and listened to the West Gate finish its note, and he thought that one has grief in it. He wrote exactly that in his notebook. Westgate, like grief that doesn't know it's over. His colleague Seema, who had known him since university and thought she understood most of his strangeness, once picked up the notebook when he'd left it on his desk at work and read a few entries before he reclaimed it. She handed it back without comment. Then, the next day said, "You know that's not a normal hobby." "I know. Most people collect magnets. Magnets don't make sounds." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you going again this year?" "March." She nodded like she'd already known. "The gates won't have changed, you realize. They're the same gates." And he looked at her and said, "I know, but I'm different." She didn't have an answer for that. He didn't need her to. He flew into Heathrow on a Thursday in early March. The city was doing its thing. That particular shade of silver that London wore in late winter, the trees still bare, but with a tentative suggestion of green at the branch tips, like the city was deciding whether to commit to spring. He took the tube to Victoria, walked the rest, counted the steps out of habit. 741. Same as always. He checked into the same hotel he'd been using since his fourth trip. Not sentimental about it. The price was reasonable, and it was the right distance. He dropped his bag, didn't unpack, opened the notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date and weather conditions at the top, and went back out. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The palace in the afternoon was a different animal from the palace at dawn. The crowds were thicker, louder, international. American voices asking about the king's schedule, Japanese tourists in precision-organized groups following laminated flags held by guides, school children in matching yellow vests being herded with the exhausted authority of teachers who had given up counting to 3. The memorial fountain was running. A boy was feeding pigeons directly against the signage prohibiting it. A woman in a red coat was crying quietly into her phone about something, turned away from the palace toward the park, as if she'd walked here without meaning to, and found herself suddenly far from home. Targ noticed all of it. He always noticed all of it. This, too, was a kind of listening. He found a position near the north gate, off to the side, not directly in front, where he'd be conspicuous. There was a bench. He sat, opened the notebook to today's page, and waited. This was the thing most people couldn't understand about him, the waiting. Most people experienced waiting as subtraction, time taken from them, time wasted, a toll charged by circumstance. Tark experienced waiting as the whole point. You couldn't hear anything if you were moving. You couldn't hear anything if you were talking. You couldn't hear anything if you were refreshing your phone or deciding what to have for dinner. Waiting meant you had cleared the space for something to arrive. He was good at clearing space. He sat on that bench for 40 minutes. The light changed. The crowd thinned slightly as the afternoon moved toward evening. A guard changed position with the precise, robot-smooth movement of a man who had drilled himself into a machine. Pigeons. Wind. The distant murmur of the city that London always kept running underneath everything. A civic heartbeat. And then, at 5:11 p.m., he noted it exactly. A palace vehicle approached the north gate from inside. The gate began to open. He put down the pen, closed his eyes, let the sound come. It was there, the groan. That same low, iron-deep throat clearing. 2 seconds, and then dissolving. But, and this was new, this was why you came back, there was something different in the register today. A slight stiffness in the first half-second, before the groan settled into itself. Like the hinge was cold. Like the gate had tensed before letting go. He opened his eyes and wrote, North Gate. 5:11 p.m. March. Colder than expected. Half-second hesitation before the groan resolves. The hinge stiffens in low temperature. The character of the sound holds. But the hesitation is new. Like something bracing itself. He sat back. Around him, nobody had looked up. Nobody had heard anything except gate noise. The pigeons continued their operations. The woman in the red coat was gone. The boy feeding pigeons had been successfully removed by a security officer who'd done it with the weary expertise of a man who did this 30 times a day. Tarek looked at what he'd written, like something bracing itself. He thought, for no reason he could name, me too. That night he ate at a small Pakistani restaurant in Southall that he discovered on his 5th visit. Not because he needed a taste of home, but because the owner was a man named Rafiq who had been in London for 30 years and knew more about this city than most people born in it. Rafiq always had opinions. Tarek found opinions useful. He didn't always share them, but he collected them the way he collected gate sounds, filed, noted, returned to later. You're back, Rafiq said. Not a question. Every year or so. The palace again? The palace again. Rafiq set down a cup of tea without being asked. You know, my nephew, he's doing a PhD at King's Architecture. He says the palace gates were last restored in 2019. The ironwork. All 4. Tarek looked up. The sounds changed after that. He didn't say. He doesn't listen to gates. Rafiq shrugged with the eloquence of a man who had spent 30 years in patient bafflement at the world's inattention. I thought you'd want to know. Tarek sat with that for a moment. He'd been here in 2021. If the sounds had changed, he hadn't had a pre-2019 visit to compare against. His 2017 notes, North Gate, East Gate, those were the last pre-restoration records he had. He pulled out the notebook. Found 2017. Read, North Gate. 6:03 a.m. February. Clear. Colder. The groan is full. No hesitation. Rolls out in one continuous sound. Like a man speaking a sentence he has rehearsed. He compared it to today's entry. Half-second hesitation before the groan resolves. It changed, he said, mostly to himself. Rafiq refilled his tea. Most things do. No. Tarek shook his head slowly. Most things sound like they changed. The actual change is smaller than people say. Rafiq looked at him for a moment, then sat down across from him, something he rarely did with customers, and folded his hands on the table. Why the gates? All these years. Why specifically the gates? Tarek looked at the question for a while before answering. Because, he said finally, everything else about that place performs. The guard perform. The tourists perform. The architecture performs. It was designed to be looked at, to communicate authority. But the gates, he paused. The gates don't know anyone is listening. They just do what they do. Open when they need to open. Make whatever sound the hinge and the iron and the weather produce. No performance. No awareness. And that matters to you. The only honest things in that whole plaza, Tarek said, are the sounds the gates make when they think no one is paying attention. Rafiq was quiet for a moment. You're a strange man, he said. My mother said quirky. Mothers are generous. But Rafiq said it warmly. He stood and went back to his kitchen, and Tarek sat with his tea and his notebook, and outside the Southall rain began, and he thought about what the North Gate would sound like tomorrow morning in the wet. He already knew he'd be there at dawn to find out. Friday morning came in wet. Not dramatically. London didn't do dramatic rain. Not usually. It did persistent rain. The kind that wasn't heavy enough to justify an umbrella, but was consistent enough to soak through the shoulders of your jacket, given 40 minutes of exposure. Tarek was exposed for considerably longer than 40 minutes. He had positioned himself by 5:30. The plaza was his at this hour. A handful of joggers crossing through on their morning routes, earphones in, eyes forward. One photographer, professional, or at least serious about it, tripod, and everything, setting up near the memorial to catch the dawn light on the facade. A police officer doing a slow, routine perimeter loop. None of them were interested in him. He was just a man on a bench with a notebook, and London was full of such people. The rain made the air thicker. He could feel it on the back of his hands, his neck. He turned the notebook's collar up, a habit, covering the pages with his arm against the drip. At 5:47, the north gate opened. He had his pen ready. The sound came, and it was different from yesterday's. The half-second hesitation was gone. The rain had done something to the hinge, loosened it, maybe, or the temperature had shifted fractionally overnight, and the groan came out full and uninterrupted, rolling the way his 2017 notes described it, like a man speaking a sentence he has rehearsed. The restoration of the iron had preserved the fundamental character, but added a cleanness to the upper registers, a slightly sharper finish to the end of the sound, where the older iron would have decayed in a softer noise. He wrote for 3 minutes straight without looking up. When he did look up, there was a royal guard standing 20 feet away, watching him. Not the changing of the guard kind, not the bearskin hat, red coat, ceremonial performance. This was operational, dark clothing, the practical uniform of palace security, the posture of someone whose job was not to be watched but to watch. The guard was older, late 40s maybe, with a face that had been rained on professionally for many years, and showed it. Short gray at the temples, hands clasped behind his back. He was watching Tarek with an expression that was not suspicious exactly, more like careful. Tarek held the man's gaze for a moment, then looked back at his notebook. The guard did not move. After perhaps 2 minutes, Tarek was not counting these minutes, which was unusual for him. The guard walked over. Not fast, not with the energy of intervention. More like a man who had decided something and was executing the decision at a reasonable pace. He stopped 3 feet from the bench, looked down at the notebook, which Tarek had not closed. "You've been here since 5:30, the guard said. Not an accusation. A fact, presented plainly. 5:27, Tarek said. The guard's expression shifted slightly. Not quite amusement. Something adjacent. "You were here yesterday afternoon as well." "Yes." "The day before?" "I arrived yesterday." "Thursday." The guard nodded slowly. Looked at the notebook again. "What are you writing?" Tarek considered the question. There were several ways to answer it, ranging from the practical, notes, to the accurate, gate acoustics, to the true, "I'm trying to understand what honest sounds like in a place designed entirely for performance." He chose something in between. "The sound the gate makes when it opens," he said. "I've been recording it for 15 years. The guard looked at him. Tarek looked back. "The north gate," the guard said. "Just now." "Yes. And the others when I can. The east I've caught 3 times. The west once. The south. Never open when I'm here. I don't think it sees much use." The guard was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of someone trained into it. Not natural stillness, the trained kind, which is more complete because it's deliberate. Then he said, "The south gate hasn't opened at dawn since 2018. They changed the staff rotation for that entrance." Tarek looked up properly now. "How does it sound when it does open?" The guard looked at him with an expression Tarek couldn't immediately categorize. It took him a moment to land on it. Recognition. "Quieter than the others," the guard said. "Much quieter. You'd almost miss it. There's a different grade of iron in the south hinge. Replaced during the Victorian extension in 1889, slightly different composition. It doesn't make the same low sound. It's thinner, higher, like a question, almost." Tarek had his pen moving before the guard finished speaking. "My name's Hargreaves," the guard said. He didn't extend a hand. Somehow it wasn't rude. Just factual. "Tarek, Pakistani, Karachi." Hargreaves nodded like this confirmed something. "About a colleague who did a posting in Islamabad. Says the city sounds different at night than any European city. Something about the way noise travels through the heat." "It does," Tarek said. "Flatter. Everything stays low. Acoustics of climate." "Yes." Another pause. Hargreaves looked at the gate. Tarek looked at Hargreaves looking at the gate. "You're not a threat," Hargreaves said. Not to Tarek specifically. More like a conclusion delivered aloud for the record. No. We notice people who come back repeatedly. It's protocol. You're in the file. Have been since your fourth visit, I think. The man with the notebook. A beat. We know the difference. Tarek absorbed this with more equanimity than he might have expected from himself. I'm in a palace security file. A small notation. You've never been close to the gates. Never try to photograph the interior. Never approach personnel. Just Hargreaves gestured at the bench, at the notebook, at the general space of this. Listening. Just listening, Tarek agreed. Hargreaves stood there another moment. Then, he said, the West Gate. You said you heard it once. 2022. A supply vehicle exiting. Evening, golden hour. And you said it sounded like grief. Tarek went very still. I said that to no one. No, but you wrote it. Hargreaves paused. We're allowed to look. We're not allowed to take. The file has a copy of 3 of your notebook pages, photographed from a distance in 2021. Standard documentation. He seemed to read something in Tarek's face. I'm telling you because I think you'd rather know than not. He was right. Tarek did rather know. The West Gate, Hargreaves said. You were right, actually, about the sound. I've worked this palace for 19 years. The West Gate is the only entrance that was present at. He stopped himself. Chose something simpler. It's the oldest intact hinge mechanism on the estate. Pre-Victorian. Whatever you heard in that sound, you heard something that has been opening and closing for a very long time. That's why, Tarek said, quietly, mostly to himself. That's why it sounds like that. Grief isn't the right word. I was reaching. He found a 2022 entry in the notebook. Westgate. Like grief that doesn't know it's over. He looked at it for a moment. What I meant was, it sounds like something that has absorbed a lot of time. Not grief. Just time. Accumulated. He closed the notebook. Most things that have absorbed a lot of time sound like that. Hargreaves looked at him for what felt like a long time. I should continue my rounds, he said finally. Of course. But he didn't move yet. The East Gate, he said. If you want it in tomorrow, there's a vehicle entering at 6:15. Not official schedule. I'm not telling you the schedule. He paused. I'm just noting that vehicles tend to enter from the east side early in the morning when the west is blocked for weekend preparation. Tarek looked up at him. Hargreaves had already turned and was walking his patrol route, hands clasped behind his back. Bache Onuriyad, a man executing a routine. Tarek looked down at the blank line under today's entry. He wrote, met Hargreaves. 19 years on this palace. He knows the South Gate sounds like a question. Then, some people listen without knowing they listen. He was back at 5:50 the next morning. The rain had cleared overnight and left the kind of cold, clean air that only exists after London rain. Washed, slightly electric, smelling of stone, and the park behind the palace, and something green and biological that the city usually buried under its own exhaust. The sky was the pale whitish blue of early morning before the sun decided what it was doing. At exactly 6:15, a black vehicle, SUV, government plates, appeared from the direction of the East Approach Road. The East Gate opened. Click. Then quiet. He had heard it 3 times before. He heard again now, and each time was like reading a sentence you had read before and finding a new word in it that you couldn't believe you'd missed. The click was there, precise, binary, a decision completed. And then the swing, that particular quietness of it, almost confidential. Like someone making a decision they've already made before. But this morning there was something else. A warmth in the quiet, the air temperature, or the condition of the metal, or some interaction of both, that gave the silence after the click a different quality. Less secretive, more resigned, almost, like the gate had given up being surprised by what was asked of it. He wrote, East Gate, 6:17 a.m. Saturday. After rain, cold clean air. The click holds. The quiet after the click is different, warmer, less like a secret kept, more like a secret accepted. The gate has learned to stop flinching. He stopped writing and read it back. The gate has learned to stop flinching. He sat with that for a while. He had written things like this before, ascribing experience to iron, assigning emotional states to mechanisms. Seema had once described it as pathetic fallacy in the technical literary sense, and then looked immediately regretful about using the word pathetic even in its original meaning. He hadn't been bothered. It wasn't that he thought the gates had feelings. It was that the sounds they made held time the way old wood held the shape of hands that had touched it. Not emotion. Record. He was a person who listened to records. His phone vibrated. His mother, back in Karachi. A voice note. He pressed play and held it to his ear. Tariq, your Aunt Sima wants to know if you're eating properly. I told her you eat properly everywhere. I want to know if you're sleeping properly. You don't sleep properly when you're there. You're always up before dawn. Call me when you're done with your gates. I love you. Also, your father says buy him a proper English biscuit, not the ones from the Pakistani shop here. He says they're different. I don't know why he can't tell the difference. Honestly, the note cut off. She'd hit the time limit. He smiled at his phone in the pale morning light. There in the empty plaza, with the notebook open in his lap, and the east gate now closed and quiet, and the whole city beginning, somewhere behind him, to stir itself awake. He typed back, eating and sleeping. I'll get Dad his biscuits. The east gate was different this morning. I think it's adjusted. He looked at the message before sending it. His mother would not know what he meant by the east gate was different this morning, and she would not ask because she had learned over many years that his notebook entries were his own language, and that asking for translation was like asking someone to explain a dream. The translation was always poorer than the thing. She would read it and reply good and mean, I'm glad you're there, and I'm glad something in you is settling and come home safe. He sent the message. The sun was beginning to make up its mind about appearing. A tourist was already setting up near the memorial, impossibly early, driven by some algorithm's recommendation of optimal photography hours. A pigeon landed on the back of the bench next to him and regarded him with the total flat apathy of London pigeons, who had long since ceased to be impressed by anything. Tariq looked at the east gate. The gate has learned to stop flinching. He thought about what Hargreaves had said. 19 years on this palace. He wondered how many times Hargreaves had heard each gate in those 19 years. Probably thousands of times, probably stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing your own fridge hum. The way you stop tasting the food you cook yourself. Proximity killed listening. He understood, sitting there, why he had to leave, why the gaps between visits were necessary. You could only hear something clearly if you came to it clean, without the accumulated sediment of too many hearings that became not hearing at all. He kept leaving so he could keep arriving. He kept arriving so the sound never became furniture. He wrote one more line before closing the notebook for the morning. He almost didn't catch it. He was late getting to the plaza, 9 in the morning rather than dawn, because he'd overslept for the first time in any of his 7 London visits, and he'd lain awake in the hotel room for a few minutes feeling the particular texture of that lateness, which was not guilt exactly, but something close, a feeling that the morning had happened without him and he'd missed the part that mattered. But he went anyway. You went anyway. The plaza was already populated, Sunday tourists, a school group that had arrived with the specific energized exhaustion of children who had been up since 5 for a bus, a man in a flat cap selling something from a small folding table that probably wasn't sanctioned. The changing of the guard was 2 hours away, and already people were positioning themselves along the railings with the anticipatory solemnity of people who have seen the queue forms early. He found his bench, the North Gate side. Habit. He had been sitting for perhaps 20 minutes, not writing yet, just watching when he heard it. It was not a gate he had categorized before. It wasn't the north. He knew that sound in his body by now, the way you know a piece of music you've listened to hundreds of times, the way the shape of it arrives before the sound does anticipated. It wasn't the east. The east click was unmistakable, surgical. It wasn't the west. The west was locked. He had checked on his walk past. It was the south. He was off the bench before he thought about it. Walking, not running. The measured pace of someone who does not want to look like he is hurrying while absolutely hurrying, navigating through the crowd with the half-apologetic movement of someone trying to cross a room without touching anyone. The South Gate was in a corner of the palace perimeter that tourists rarely photographed. Not invisible, but not the point of interest. There was a maintenance truck parked nearby, and 2 workers in high-vis vests conferring over a clipboard. And the gate was open. He stopped 15 feet away. He had come too late. The gate was already open. He had missed the sound. He stood there looking at the open gate, the way you look at the space on a wall where a painting used to be. You can tell a thing was there. You can almost see the outline. But the thing itself is gone, and the space it left is shaped wrong. Then, the maintenance worker nearest the truck noticed something on his clipboard, said something to his colleague, and walked back through the gate. It would have to close. Tarek went very still. The wind had dropped. Around him, the crowd moved and chatted, and a child asked a question in French, and a pigeon did pigeon things, and the flat-cap man said something about commemorative something to a passing couple. All of it receded. He was aware of it the way you are aware of water when you're underwater, present, surrounding, but irrelevant to the matter of breathing. The gate closed. Hargreaves had said, quieter than the others. You'd almost miss it. Like a question. He had not been wrong. But question hadn't been specific enough, or it had been specific in the way of a person who heard the sound but listened to other things more. What Tarek heard was not a question in the interrogative sense. It was a question in the way that some architectural spaces are questions, the way a long corridor makes you wonder what's at the end before you've decided to walk toward it. It was the sound of an opening made tentative by what it had been opened to. High and thin, as Hargreaves had said, different iron, older composition, the Victorian extension hinge that didn't have the base authority of the others. But not weak. Precise. Refined. A sound that had exactly the weight it intended to have, and no more. He stood looking at the now-closed south gate. He had waited 15 years for that. He did not write immediately. He stood still and let the sound live in him for a few minutes before he turned it into words, because words changed it, compressed it, fixed it, and some small part of the living thing escaped in the compression, always. He wanted to hold the uncompressed version for as long as he could. Then he opened the notebook and wrote. He wrote for a long time. Afterward, he found Hargreaves. Not searching specifically, he was simply walking the perimeter, post-writing, doing what he always did after a new entry, which was walk and let the thoughts settle and see if anything else arrived. And Hargreaves was there, at his position near the north, doing his loop. The guard saw him and stopped. You heard it, Hargreaves said. Not a question. Yes. Hargreaves nodded slowly, like a man receiving news he'd half expected. What did you think? Tarek looked at him for a moment. He thought about the words he'd written, like the first question asked in a new room before you know whether the room is safe. He thought about whether that would mean anything to a man who'd spent 19 years listening to the same sounds until he'd stopped hearing them. I think, he said carefully, that it's the most honest one. Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. The others, Tarek paused, trying to find the right way in. The North has weight, history. It knows it's important. The East has precision, military, deliberate. The West has depth, all that accumulated time. They all know their palace gates. He stopped. The South sounds like it's not sure, like it's still asking whether it belongs here. Hargreaves was quiet for a long moment. The South entrance, he said finally, was the servants' entrance. Historically, before the 1912 renovation changed the staff configuration. He paused. I don't know if that's relevant. Tarek looked at the gate. He thought, of course it is. The gate that had been used by people who weren't sure they belonged, who entered sideways, who were permitted but not celebrated, who were necessary but not the point of the ceremony. That gate had absorbed something. The iron had held it. The hinge carried it, right through the Victorian replacement and the 2019 restoration and everything that came after. The most honest one. He wrote this conversation down later in the hotel room and then sat looking at what he'd written for a long time. He had one more day. Monday morning, his flight was in the evening. He went to the plaza at dawn one last time. 5:30, the dark still in the sky with just the gray beginning at the edges, the city performing its slow conversion from night to not night. Cold. No rain. He sat on the bench. He did not open the notebook. This was unusual. He always opened the notebook. The notebook was the point. But this morning he sat with it closed in his hands and just listened. Not for a gate opening, not for a specific sound to document. Just listened to the whole space. The city behind him, its permanent low murmur. The wind in the trees of the park. His own breathing. The soft sound of the guard's footstep on the gravel somewhere to his left. He had been coming here for 15 years to listen to a specific thing. This morning he was listening to everything. He thought about his mother, who had brought him here at 11 because she believed in primary sources, and how she had no idea that the primary source she'd given him access to was not the palace, not the history, not the royal architecture or the ceremonial tradition. It was the sound of gates, the unglamorous, unremarkable, nobody-listening sound of iron hinges doing their job. He thought about his father, who wanted biscuits. He thought about Seema, who thought he collected a strange thing but had never once asked him to stop. He thought about Hargreaves, who had listened without knowing he listened, and who had given him the South Gate without being asked for it, and who had done this as naturally as you'd hand someone something they dropped. He thought about all the versions of himself that had sat on this bench or stood nearby. The 11-year-old with his mother's hand, cold and confused and hearing something in a gate he couldn't name. The 19-year-old who had started the second notebook with the trembling seriousness of someone who had decided this was going to matter. The 22-year-old who had heard the West Gate moan and felt it in his sternum and known, without being able to explain it, that the world contained more information than people were bothering to collect. The 26-year-old who had finally heard all four. At 5:47, the North Gate cleared its throat. He didn't open the notebook. He closed his eyes and let the sound arrive and sat within the dark behind his eyelids. 2 seconds. Iron deep. The slight stiffness of a cold morning in the first half-second. Then the resolve. Then the dissolving. Like a man speaking a sentence he has rehearsed. That was 2017. Like something bracing itself. That was Thursday. Today was both. Today was a man who had rehearsed a sentence for a long time and was still, after all this time, bracing before he said it. He thought, I understand that. He opened his eyes. The pale sky. The guard changing position. A pigeon. The beginning of a crowd. Still small, still scattered. He opened the notebook. Not to write a gate entry. He opened to the first page. The page he transferred from the second notebook, which had been transferred from the first green one that had died in the monsoon. The oldest entry he still had. North Gate. 5:47 a.m. Like a man clearing his throat before saying something important. 2 seconds. Iron. Deeper than the East Gate will probably be. He had been 11. He had not yet known what he was starting. He read it for a while. Then he closed the notebook and held it in both hands, there in the pale Monday morning, with the palace performing behind him and the gates doing what they'd always done and the city beginning to assemble itself into another day. He thought, I came here to listen to gates. He thought, what I was actually listening for was the world's permission to pay attention to things nobody else was paying attention to. He thought, I found it. In iron. In a hinge. In a 2-second groan at 5:47 in the morning that nobody else was writing down. He stood up from the bench, tucked the notebook into his inside jacket pocket, straightened his coat, looked at the North Gate for a moment, which was already closed, which had already forgotten it had opened. I'll be back, he said to no one. To the gate. To himself. He walked back toward the hotel. 741 steps. He counted them without thinking. He always counted them without thinking. The city was waking up around him, shops beginning their openings, delivery vehicles making their morning rounds, a man in a bakery slapping flour from his hands against his apron in the doorway, a woman cycling fast with a bag on her back, and headphones in, and some expression on her face that was between determination and terror, and was maybe just being late. He bought his father's biscuits at an actual English grocery, not a tourist shop, because his father was right. They were different, and people who knew the difference deserved to have the difference respected. He texted his mother, coming home tonight. All 4 gates this trip. I heard the South. She replied within a minute. What does it sound like? He walked another half block before answering. Like the first question asked in a new room before you know whether the room is safe. A pause. He could see the 3 dots appearing. I don't understand. I know, he typed. It's okay. I'll explain when I'm home. She sent a heart. He put his phone away and walked, and the morning opened around him the way mornings do when you haven't slept enough and are full of something you haven't yet found the right words for, a little unsteady, a little bright, a little more than yourself. He was back the following March. Different hotel. The old one had changed ownership and raised the price by 40%. Different bench. The north side bench had been replaced with a newer model, slightly lower, which changed the angle at which he sat, which changed marginally the acoustics of listening. He adjusted. New notebook. Fifth one. Brown. Same as the last, because the stall near Sadar still stocked them, because the stall owner's son had learned by now to put one aside in March. He didn't know why Tarek wanted them. He didn't ask. He just put one aside. The north gate opened at 5:47. Same sound. Mostly. There was something new in the upper register. Just slightly. Just enough. He couldn't name it yet. He wrote, North Gate. 5:47 March. New element in upper register. Return visit. Adjusting. He read it back. Smiled at himself. Adjusting. That was the thing about listening carefully to a thing for a very long time. You changed. The thing changed. Neither of you changed enough for the other to become unrecognizable. But you changed. And the gap between who you were and who you are was measurable in notebook pages, in the distance between like a man clearing his throat and like something bracing itself, and everything in between. The record was not just of the gates. It had never only been of the gates. He understood this now, sitting on the bench in the cold March morning, the city assembling itself around him, the gates doing what they'd always done, honest and unpretentious and unaware of being heard. He was the instrument. The gates were the music, and the music went on.